You're listening to the Vocabbett podcast, where I help students improve their vocabulary for the SAT, ACT, and life itself using my unique and research-backed story-based method. On this podcast, I'm sharing the best tips and tricks for a more enriched vocabulary and pain-free test day. Hello, and welcome to episode number 6 of the Vocabbett podcast. I'm Erica Abbett, a former English and history teacher, the author of the young adult novel Ahead of Her Time, and the founder of the vocabulary company Vocabbett. So if you go to Vocabbett this week, my website, vocabbett.com, depending on what time you go, which way the wind is blowing, and how the gods of the internet are feeling, you may or may not actually land on my website. You might get an error page. And I just wanted to give you a heads up about that in advance because all of that is totally predictable and it's totally okay. I am actually changing servers and hosting platforms and stuff like that at the moment in order to enable something really, really exciting that I'm going to announce next week. But in order to make all of that possible, I needed to switch platforms and just really get a little bit more control and professionalism on the Vocabbett website. And I have since learned that it didn't need to be quite this complicated, but all of this tech stuff is a little bit out of my bailiwick. Bailiwick, by the way, is a fancy word for kind of sphere of operations. It's related to the word bailiff and bail. It's like I'm pretending I'm a cop and I'm saying this is out of my jurisdiction. All of this tech stuff is kind of out of my bailiwick. It's like, and I'm an old-timey British cop. It's out of my jurisdiction. But anyway, until next Tuesday, when I unveil the really exciting stuff coming up at Vocabbett, I am still here with you as ever with more vocabulary boosting stories, and I'm just getting those incidental impressions in with you. If you're new here, the research indicates that most people need to hear a new word 8 times in order to learn it, and I'm a big believer in contextual impressions. So just me talking to you, kind of sneak attack dropping these big words. It's how you learned the majority of your native tongue. It's why if you want to learn a new language, immersion is the best way to do that. Your brain is really trained to catalog those incidental impressions very efficiently and effectively. So my method, essentially, I just kind of drop big words when I'm talking to you like this. And then I also write stories where I more intentionally work them in numerous times to help you get those impressions even more. So that's kind of my method is I'm trying to get you 8 impressions of words that you wouldn't otherwise get in your daily life, like bailiwick, but that you might need on standardized tests like the SAT. So today's story actually ties into all of that really well because one big pillar, so to speak, of the Vocabbett philosophy is that around the 9th grade level, the vocabulary that we start to encounter in the day-to-day starts to stagnate. When you're a kid, so many words are new that your vocabulary really expands kind of on its own. You know, we don't have to put flashcards in the crib with kids. But then by around 9th grade, the words that you encounter just in your everyday life, people just kind of stop continuing to grow their vocabulary around that point. And so that's when we have to really start using all of these kind of artificial supplementation techniques. And we started earlier, but it's around 9th grade that we really have to get serious about it with the flashcards and the study guides and the computer programs and expensive tutors and courses, all to improve our vocabulary for the SAT. But again, I really believe your vocabulary would continue to grow the way it did when you were, a child if the words that you were exposed to in your everyday life continued to expand. And one big exception to what I'm talking about, I've been saying that a lot of stuff starts to stagnate, but one big exception is the Amelia Peabody series by Elizabeth Peters. I honestly probably learned half of my, big word vocabulary just hanging out with Amelia Peabody. This series takes place in the early 1900s in Egypt, and I'll link to the first book in the show notes. And the story that I'm going to share today, it's really paying homage to the Amelia Peabody series. And I got the idea from a prompt on Readsy. I can't remember the exact language of it. It was actually a few years ago. But I did want you to know that I did not come up with the entire concept on my own. It's pretty unique, and I want to give Readsy credit for giving me the idea for this. And the crux of the story is this. You know how actors have to audition for different roles? What if characters, the actual characters themselves, had to go audition? If a certain character wanted to be in a book, the author would have to meet them and cast them. So I've put one of the villains from the Amelia Peabody series in this story. And if you haven't read this series, I don't think it'll really matter. I think you'll still like it because there are a lot of other characters that you probably will know. There's Voldemort and the Wicked Witch of the West, Gollum, Smeagol from Lord of the Rings, Wickham from Pride and Prejudice. You'll see a lot of familiar faces, even if you haven't read the Amelia Peabody series. There's really only a little bit of the story that you might not pick up on. And, for instance, there's a line about an umbrella in here. It's kind of sentimental. And you're like, why is someone getting sentimental over an umbrella? And it's because Amelia Peabody, a parasol, which is like an old-timey umbrella, that's like her thing. She pokes people with it. And by the end of the series, I think she has one that she can snap it and a sword comes out. So that's the only thing that you might be like, what's going on with this umbrella here? And it's just referencing Amelia's parasol. That's like her weapon of choice. So anyway, without further ado, here is Casting Call, author seeking new villain. Casting Call, author seeking new villain. A vocabulary boosting short story by Erica Abbett. My name is Hannibal Lecter, and I pass. Caroline politely shuffled the papers on her desk, giving the villain a moment to collect his dignity before walking away. Instead, he growled and threw the script at her before storming off. And you wonder why I didn't want to work with you, she muttered, collecting scattered pages from the floor of the studio. By the time she was done, Caroline felt like growling herself. When the room was once again presentable, Caroline poked her head into the foyer where the other applicants were waiting. Lord Voldemort and the Wicked Witch of the West were arguing over whether the basilisk or the flying monkey made a more fearsome familiar. Wickham buffed his nails on the couch, and a large elderly woman dominated the armchair, surrounded by her knitting. Gollum was digging through a potted tree in the corner, murmuring something about preciouses. As Caroline entered, a spray of dirt from Gollum's wiry fingers hit Voldemort in the face. His nostrils would have flared, if he had any. With a sharp swish of his cloak, Voldemort raised his wand and began, Avada. Stop, Caroline cried. Really? Murder during an interview? I can see already that your services won't be required. Wickham looked up, bored. Told you, she's a romance author. You're not her type. You told me? Voldemort hissed. The Wicked Witch of the West slapped his wand down. You may be everyone's favorite now, she warned, but once word gets around that you're difficult to work with, took me 50 years to book Wicked after The Wizard of Oz. I've never had any trouble reprising my role, Wickham drawled, crossing his legs in his neatly pressed slacks. Smeagol, too, Gollum agreed, still at work destroying the greenery. Why did I ever decide to change series? Caroline wondered aloud. Next. The elderly knitter, who had watched the proceedings with mild interest and only chimed in via the click-click-click of her needles, put away her yarn and rose to join Caroline. Nice to meet you, Miss, Caroline ventured. Oh, names are so personal, aren't they, dearie? The woman asked, taking her arm. Caroline brought the woman into her studio, flushing with embarrassment when she realized there was nowhere for her to sit. All the other applicants had simply auditioned, standing before her desk. Please, Caroline said, motioning to her own chair. Oh, that won't be necessary. Caroline's jaw dropped. The voice had transformed from a shaky old woman's to that of a vibrant, educated British man. What? The elderly woman's stooped shoulders straightened, and she began removing wig, glasses, false teeth. When the transformation was complete, a British man in the prime of his life stood before Caroline, dressed in an oversized knit sweater. I'm a master of disguise, you see, which makes me the perfect fit for your new novel, he remarked. I can conform to any plot you create. The man withdrew a thick piece of paper from his bag of yarn. Here's my resume, he began. As you can see, in addition to my talent in the art of disguise, I thrive in high-stress situations. My last author had me managing Egypt's illegal antiquities market for years, and I rarely harm anyone who doesn't truly deserve it. Caroline eyed the man before her, unable to believe the transformation she just witnessed. He was no Mrs. Doubtfire either. There wasn't a doubt in her mind that the person she invited into the room had been an elderly American woman. How did you... Disguise is more about mannerisms and affectations than crude physical alterations, he explained. We see what we expect. Stooped shoulders made me appear several inches shorter, and surrounded by knitting, why should I not be an elderly woman? Caroline looked at his resume. The name at the top read, The Master Criminal. The Master Criminal, she asked? Is that what you expect me to call you? I've also been known as the genius of crime, if you prefer. He smiled, displaying even white teeth. But my friends call me Sethos. Caroline found it impossible not to smile back. Why did you leave your last story, Mr. Sethos? Suffice it to say, I became a little too close to the family I was meant to be antagonizing. Would you believe I actually started saving them more than robbing them? Why do you think that is? For a moment, the man's gaze lingered on Caroline's umbrella, leaning against the wall in the corner of the room. A smile touched the edge of his lips. It's her fault, I suppose. She vowed to change me, and no one can resist her, not even I. Interesting. Caroline tapped the pen on her desk. A villain with a conscience. A villain who rescues the protagonist. I did kidnap her a time or two also, Sethos said defensively, and I'd really prefer not to be typecast in future roles. Oh, the larceny and antiquities theft, that would be fine. But don't expect me to get attached to another family. I have a hard enough time keeping Amelia and the rest of the Emersons out of trouble as it is. Caroline grinned. I wouldn't dream of stepping on another author's toes. But if you're interested in a new series, one with ample vacation time, mind you, leaving you free to pop in and out of other books, I may have a job for you. All right, so that was Casting Call, Author Seeking New Villain. Please forgive my, I'm sure, atrocious British accent. I couldn't really help it. The character is British and I'm reading it, so I kind of did the best I could. But those of you who are actually British in the audience, please don't judge. I will be back on Thursday with another vocabulary boosting short story. And then next Tuesday, be sure to tune in because I'm making a really exciting announcement about some big changes happening at Vocabbett and just a lot of new ways that I'm going to be able to serve you and help you really painlessly boost your vocabulary. If you liked this story, if you're enjoying this podcast, please be sure to subscribe. And if you have a second, leave it a 5-star review. And I will see you on Thursday.